So up next is Justin Franz, who's going to take us to the Northwest for this presentation. Justin is a writer, editor, and photographer who lives in Whitefish, Montana, just steps away from the Great Northern Main line. Justin grew up in Maine, where he acquired his interest in trains from his father, Tim, who spent 10 years as a railroader. In 2007, Justin moved to Montana and later graduated with a degree in print journalism from the University of Montana. He spent several years with the Flathead Beacon, and his work has appeared in Trains Magazine, Railroad Heritage, Travel and Leisure, Atlas Obscura, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has a captivating true crime podcast called Project 7, which is just out. The first 2 episodes have dropped. They are fantastic. Make sure you check that out if you need another podcast right now, and who doesn't? And just 2 weeks ago, Justin became the associate editor of Railfan and Railroad Magazine and Railroad Model Craftsman Magazine. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to Justin Franz.
Cool. Well, first off, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Scott. I really appreciate it. And just to make sure, is my full screen sharing, right? Is that coming in?
Coming in great on my end.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Scott, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my work today. Really seen some fantastic programs throughout the week, and this morning I really loved your program, Dennis, and I really loved the J. Parker Lamb program. In fact, my dad, who's watching from Maine right now, hi Dad, texted me and said it's a good thing that I wasn't following the Lamb show, and frankly, I don't disagree. I guess I'm getting pretty lucky by following the lunch hour. So with that said, let's jump into the show and travel back in time, 128 years exact, to Kalispell, Montana. On January 2nd, 1892, 3,500 people gathered in downtown Kalispell, Montana, a dusty little town in the northwest corner of the state, to celebrate the arrival of the Great Northern Railway. For months, the townspeople had been nervously waiting to find out where exactly the Great Northern's transcontinental railroad would cross the lush Flathead Valley. They were anxious because the arrival of a transcontinental railroad would put any town, even this town, on the map. But on this cold winter day, there was no longer any doubt about where the Great Northern was building its track. Kalispell was about to become a railroad town. To mark the monumentous occasion, a local community club had gathered silver dollars and melted them down to make a silver spike that would be ceremoniously hammered into the ties, just as they had done at Promontory, Utah 23 years earlier, at the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. After the first train steamed into town, hundreds of track builders joined thousands of townspeople to parade through the streets on their way to a banquet. A reporter for the Salt Lake Tribune described the scene like this: "The citizens are justly enthusiastic over the advent of the Great Northern. Bands played upon the streets all afternoon, repeatedly serenading the railroad officials in their sturdy crews. And tonight, the city is ablaze with bonfires and colored lights that can be seen in every quarter of the city. This is the red-letter day for the metropolis of the Flathead Valley, one long to be remembered by everyone who witnessed the demonstration." But that celebration did not last long. Within a decade, the tracks through Kalispell would be nothing more than a branch line after the Great Northern had found a better route through Montana's Flathead Valley. What happened in northwest Montana serves as a microcosm for what happened all across the American West during the 19th, 20th, and even 21st centuries. As railroads altered their routes, usually in search of more business or easier grades, the fortunes of those towns could change. The fortunes of those towns along those lines could change almost overnight, creating a mosaic of winners and losers. In this program, which was originally presented at Conversations Transcontinental in Provo, Utah in March 2019, and has been updated for today's program, or for today's conference, we'll briefly look at the phenomenon as it played out on 3 transcontinental railroads across the northern part of the country: the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, and the Milwaukee Road. But our primary focus will be how this story of winners and losers has played out on one stretch of former Great Northern Main Line in northwest Montana. and it's a story that will be mostly illustrated with my own images depicting the area's two railroads, BNSF Railway's dramatic battle to climb and conquer nearby Marias Pass, and the Mission Mountain Railroad's Kalispell branch. But first, a little history. 14 years after the Golden Spike was driven at Promontory, transcontinental railroading arrived in the Northwest in the form of the Northern Pacific. 20 years earlier, in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln signed the charter for the Northern Pacific. The owners struggled to finance the railroad's construction. Work finally began in 1870, a year after Promontory, but financial troubles continued. The railroad's primary financer, J. Cook, had underestimated how much it would cost to build a railroad into the wilderness that had only been explored by Lewis and Clark a half-century earlier. The railroad filed for bankruptcy before its line to the west coast was even completed. Despite those setbacks, the Northern Pacific continued to build into the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, and Washington. One team built from the east, and another worked from the west. Finally, after 13 years of work, the railroad was completed near Gold Creek, Montana, in 1883. The next transcontinental railroad across the northern part of the country was the Great Northern, brainchild of railroad baron James J. Hill. The Canadian-born Hill had initially made his money in shipping and coal, but after the Civil War, he began looking to invest in railroads. Hill and a group of investors purchased the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad in 1879, and Hill became its general manager. Over the next decade, Hill expanded his railroad throughout the Midwest, but by the 1880s, he realized that in order to remain relevant, he needed to build west. In 1887, track layers began to work west from Minot, North Dakota, extending the railroad, by then renamed the Great Northern, into Montana. Once he arrived at the foot of the Rockies, Hill had two choices. He could save time and money and purchase the Northern Pacific, which, despite having completed its own transcontinental line a few years earlier, was still in financial trouble, or he could build his own route. For years, there had been rumors of a low mountain pass just south of the Canadian border that was used by the Blackfeet tribe to cross the Continental Divide. But as of the late 1880s, no Anglo-American had mapped it, although legend has it they came close decades earlier. In the 1850s, Congress had appropriated $150,000 to the War Department to survey 4 routes west for a transcontinental railroad. Engineer James Doty was assigned to survey the northern route, and in 1854 was reportedly exploring the area of the eastern half of what is today Glacier National Park. Doty apparently found what he believed was the eastern slope of what would eventually be called Marias Pass. He excitedly reported back to Washington, D.C., that he found an ideal crossing of the Northern Rockies. Doty argued that if he had more time and money, he could confirm his discovery the following year. However, according to legend, Doty was told to come back east because Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who would eventually become the President of the Confederate States of America, preferred a more southern route. In 1889, James J. Hill sent engineer John F. Stevens into the wilderness with the goal of finding Marias Pass. Stevens was no stranger to plotting mountain railroads, having previously engineered the Canadian Pacific and parts of the Rio Grande. According to a story later promoted by the Great Northern, Stevens and a native guide headed east into the mountains from what is today Browning, Montana, in December 1889. Not far from what they suspected was the eastern slope of Marias Pass, the native guide fell ill and announced that he could go no further. Stevens continued alone. Not long after, Stevens found a wide spot in the mountains and a creek that flowed west, confirming that this was indeed Marias Pass. But Stevens' adventure had only just begun. According to legend, Stevens was trapped in a storm and had to build a fire to survive a night with temperatures that dipped to 40 below. The following morning, after the storm had passed, Stevens headed back east and found his native guide clinching to life. Stevens aided the man back to health and got him back to Browning, and then continued east to report to James J. Hill that he had found a new northwest passage. By the way, you'll note that I said according to legend a few times. That's because the story of Stevens' ordeal comes from a book published by the Great Northern Railway in 1925. Now, I'm not saying the story isn't true. But I will say that the Great Northern's marketing team was not afraid to exaggerate the truth in their efforts to promote the railroad. Perhaps the most famous example of these fibs came in the 1920s when the railroad hired a taxidermist to add fur to a trout so that they could spread a story about how the Glacier National Park were so cold fish had to grow fur to survive. Getting back to our story, a year after Stevens mapped Pass, Great Northern was laying track up and over the Continental Divide. By January 1892, they had reached Kalispell, Montana, and a year later, the final spike was driven in the Cascade Mountains at scenic Washington. The third and final transcontinental railroad across the northern part of the country was the Milwaukee Road. The Milwaukee was a regional railroad in the Midwest that relied on the two other northern transcons to reach western markets. Just like Hill, the Milwaukee Road's owners believed that the railroad needed to build west in order to survive. In 1906, the railroad began construction on the Pacific Extension that would extend the Milwaukee from the Dakotas all the way to Tacoma, Washington. Like the previous two railroads, laborers worked from the east and west. Amazingly, the railroad was built in just 3 years, and the final spike was driven in May 1909 near Garrison, Montana, not far from where the Northern Pacific had completed their route about 25 years earlier. The Milwaukee stood out almost immediately for its decision to embrace electrification, something no other railroad had done on the same scale. While the Great Northern used electrics on a short stretch of track in the Cascade Mountains, the Milwaukee decided to put wire above two large sections of railroad in Montana, Idaho, and Washington. But despite that bold move to electrify, the Milwaukee was never a stable operation. By the 1970s, the railroad was falling apart, and in 1980, the third transcontinental railroad built across the northern part of the country became the first to go when the railroad was abandoned west of Miles City, Montana. Today, most of the Milwaukee Road's Pacific Coast extension has been ripped up, but there are still signs of its existence scattered across the Northwest in forms of old signals, bridges, and substations. Perhaps the most spectacular section has been turned into a bike trail on the Montana-Idaho border that includes the mile-long St. Paul Tunnel. The route of the Hiawatha Trail is an incredible ride that takes you through a number of tunnels and over some incredible bridges, two of which can be seen in this photo. Sections of the Milwaukee Road do remain in service, however, and perhaps the most interesting segment is found near St. Mary's, Idaho. After the railroad was abandoned west of Miles City, the Potlatch Corporation purchased the main line from Avery to Plummer in the northern part of the state, along with a branch down to Beauville, so that it could move logs from the forest to its mill at St. Mary's. By the 2000s, the St. Mary's River Railroad was among the last logging railroads in North America, and it was operating in much the same fashion as it had under the Milwaukee Road in the 1960s and 1970s. Although it is a tired cliche, visiting St. Mary's, Idaho in the early 2000s was almost like going back in time, thanks to the vintage locomotives and continued use of cabooses. Starting in 2008, I frequently made the trip, the 3-hour drive from Missoula, Montana, where I was attending the University of Montana, to St. Mary's, and I'm glad I did. Within 2 years of my first visit, the log train stopped running. Today, the St. Mary's continues to move finished lumber to the Union Pacific interchange at Plummer, as seen in this image from October 2018. While trains still rumble through St. Mary's and Plummer, the departure of the Milwaukee Road some 40 years ago left towns all across the northern tier of the country without rail service and with few links to the outside world. Some of those towns have never recovered. While only a few short segments of the Milwaukee Road live on, the Northern Pacific and Great Northern Main lines continue to play an important role in the economy of the Pacific Northwest. In 1970, the Northern Pacific and Great Northern, along with the Burlington and the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle, merged to form Burlington Northern. The merger resulted in the newly formed Burlington Northern having two main lines to the Pacific Northwest. The architects of that 1970 merger had initially considered turning the Northern Pacific into a lightly used secondary route, but that plan quickly changed with the arrival of export coal traffic out of the Powder River Basin. However, The former Northern Pacific still posed an operating challenge for Burlington Northern, specifically because of two stiff mountain grades over Bozeman and Mullen Passes. In 1987, Burlington Northern decided to spin off 900 miles of former Northern Pacific from Billings, Montana to Sandpoint, Idaho. Montana native and noted businessman Dennis Washington leased the southern main line and created Montana Railink, a regional railroad that continues to operate today. Over the years, Montana Railink has earned a major following among railroad enthusiasts, thanks in part to its friendly employees and vintage motive power. In this 2016 view, you can see three SD40-2s lugging a freight up the east slope of Mullen Pass, years after most Class I railroads had delegated locomotives like this to secondary service. But perhaps the route that has fared the best of the three northern transcontinentals is the Great Northern, which today serves as BNSF Railway's primary route to the Pacific Northwest. But, like the Milwaukee Road and the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern across Montana has also seen its fair share of change over the decades. The Great Northern's original main line through northwest Montana passed through Columbia Falls, Kalispell, and Libby, closely following the path taken by U.S. Highway 2 at the bottom of this map. But 10 years after thousands of people gathered in downtown Kalispell to celebrate the arrival of the Great Northern in the Flathead Valley, the railroad decided it was tired of moving freight over a stiff mountain grade called Haskell Pass, about halfway between Kalispell and Libby. So it began to survey a new route through the area that would bypass Kalispell. Initially, the Great Northern hid its intentions by saying it was only surveying a route through the northern part of the Flathead Valley because it was looking to build a branch into the coal fields of British Columbia and Alberta. But soon, locals realized that the Great Northern was preparing to leave town. The new route headed west from Columbia Falls and went through Whitefish and Eureka before reconnecting with the original main line near Libby. The 15 or so miles from Columbia Falls to Kalispell would become a branch, and the original main line between Kalispell and Libby would be abandoned. Years later, the construction of a hydroelectric dam near Libby would result in another line relocation, which included the creation of the Flathead Tunnel, seen in the middle of this map. Following the 1904 line relocation, the Kalispell Division headquarters were moved 15 miles north to Whitefish, and almost overnight, the community of Kalispell lost more than 200 jobs. According to the newspapers of the era, quote, a great gloom spread over Kalispell as the town worried it would become nothing more than a wide spot in the road, like so many other ghost towns created by the railroad's departure. Thankfully, Kalispell did not shrivel up and die like its townspeople had feared. Although today, more than a century after the division point move from Kalispell to Whitefish, it seems as if Kalispell still holds a little bit of animosity towards its northern neighbor, even if that only plays out in high school gymnasiums. The changing map of the Great Northern through northwest Montana, and indirectly the fate and fortunes of the communities along it, has been a major focus for my photography in recent years. After graduating from the University of Montana in 2011, I moved to the Flathead Valley for a job at a newspaper. Before I'd even unpacked my car, though, I started making trips to Marias Pass to photograph BNSF's dramatic battle to climb and conquer the Continental Divide. Marias Pass has long been a popular destination for rail fans because of its stunning scenery, part of which is in Glacier National Park. The historic record shows that James J. Hill saw the mountains of Montana as an obstacle, but his son Louis saw them as an opportunity to fill passenger trains. The younger Hill became an ardent supporter of the establishment of a national park in northwest Montana, and, according to legend, Hill actually twisted some arms in Washington, D.C. to get it created in 1910. Once the park was signed into law by President Howard Taft, and the Great Northern immediately got to work developing the park and its surrounding landscape. In the 1910s, the Great Northern built two massive hotels in the park, including this one on Swift Current Lake, as well as a number of backcountry chalets. The accommodations were meant to enable visitors to be engulfed by the wilderness while still being within reach of the amenities of modern life. Although he was still president of the Great Northern, Louis Hill spent much of the decade focused on the developments in Glacier Park. Hill allegedly picked the exact location of each and every chalet in the park, and even cared about small details like what type of soap would be stocked at the hotels. Louis Hill took his work in Glacier Park so seriously that he once told a confidant that, quote, "The work is so important that I am loath to entrust the development to anybody but for myself. For that reason, I shall give a major part of my life to the park." According to some accounts, the Great Northern Railway spent $10, $1 the federal government spent in Glacier National Park during the early years of the park's development, although some historians dispute that figure. Doing photography along Marias Pass is not without its challenges. For one, it is a very remote area that just so happens to be home to one of the largest grizzly bear populations in the lower 48. So if you happen to be there doing some rare photography, I highly recommend getting a can of bear spray. Thankfully, in my 8 years of rail fanning and hiking in Glacier National Park, my run-ins with bears have been few and far between, and I haven't had to deploy that yet. Perhaps the best part of photographing trains on Marias Pass is trying to capture the railroad against the changing seasons. The landscape is constantly evolving, like in this photo. Beargrass flowers are commonly found in June around Glacier National Park, and they were particularly abundant in 2017. In fact, many people who've lived in the area for decades says it was one of the best blooms they've ever seen. But BNSF isn't the only railroad in northwest Montana. In fact, the long diminished branch between Columbia Falls and Kalispell, which was once the main line, still sees trains every week. Watco Company's Mission Mountain Railroad was created in the mid-2000s after BNSF decided it no longer wanted to operate on two different branches in northwest Montana. I began photographing the Mission Mountain shortly after my arrival in the area in 2011. Of particular interest to me was the trackage through downtown Kalispell. Although part of the yard in Kalispell had been ripped up to make way for a shopping mall in the 1980s, the remaining track through town offered a taste of urban railroading that you don't often find in Montana. It also didn't hurt that the newspaper I worked for was literally a block from the tracks. Over the last 9 years, if it was nice out and I heard a train go by while I was at work, I'd try and come up with some sort of excuse to leave the office. I would tell my editor I had to go to the courthouse or city hall to pull documents or something, so that I could sneak out and take a few photos. It didn't take long for my coworkers to catch on to my scheme. However, in the last few years, those trips to City Hall or the courthouse have taken on a sense of urgency. For years, the city of Kalispell has dreamed of ripping up 2 miles of track through downtown Kalispell to make way for a trail and commercial and residential developments. The plan got a major boost in October 2015 when Kalispell received a $10 million federal grant to build a new rail-served industrial park east of town that has become home for the final 2 rail customers in downtown Kalispell, a grain elevator and a drywall distributor. In early 2018, with the blessing of my editor at the newspaper, I began spending even more time photographing the Mission Mountain through downtown Kalispell. In March 2018, I spent a day with the crew of the Kalispell Local as they switched cars on the 13-mile branch between Columbia Falls and Kalispell. I have long been a fan of the work of photographers like Blair Poistra, Ted Benson, and John Gruber, photographers who focused on people rather than locomotives. Of course, I came of age in the years after September 11th, when railroads became considerably more suspicious of someone hanging around with a camera. Because of that, the opportunity to interact with railroaders, much less photograph them, is exceedingly rare in 2020. Thankfully, the management of the Mission Mountain was incredibly supportive of the project and allowed me to go literally wherever I wanted throughout the course of it. However, I wanted to make sure that this project was about more than just the railroad that came into Kalispell, but was also about the people and industries that supported it. So I soon started stopping by the grain elevator when they were loading covered hoppers and visiting the local drywall warehouse. Just like the people on the Mission Mountain, management at the grain elevator and the drywall distributor were incredibly supportive of the project and never once shooed me away when I visited. They always just said the same thing: don't get hurt. I was even there for a few mishaps like this one. Normally, the elevator crew would open up the bottom of covered hoppers and get any old grain out before loading new grain. But on this day, it turns out the previous customer had left about half a load inside the car. The manager, seen on the left, asked me that this shot not go in the newspaper. I also spent time at the drywall distributor near downtown and, on one cold day, photographed the process of unloading a single center beam flat car, including the process of picking up leftover wrapping and shipping material. If anything, the day was a great reminder that railroading is about so much more than just locomotives and freight cars. Thanks to my job at the newspaper, I was also able to cover some of the events associated with the construction of the new rail park and the planning of the downtown trail, including the driving of a golden spike in 2018 when the new industrial park was completed, even a century and a half after the completion of the first transcontinental railroad at Promontory, Utah. A golden spike is still the only way to finish a railroad, although I'm pretty sure that this one was simply painted gold. When I first gave this presentation at CRPA's Conversations Transcontinental in March 2019, the Mission Mountain was still running into downtown Kalispell with some regularity, while the final two customers, a grain elevator and a drywall distributor, put the finishing touches on their new facilities at the rail park east of town. In the early fall, the Mission Mountain delivered its final grain train to the elevator. The drywall distributor took a little bit longer to move into its new home and was getting loads until December. Knowing that the last run was near, I began to pester both the railroad and the warehouse on an almost daily basis. And every morning as I drove into work, I'd glance over at the spur to see if there was a load sitting at the ready. Thankfully, both the railroad and the warehouse understood the historic nature of the event and were generous with their time and information, as they always have been. On December 13, 2019, the Mission Mountain would deliver its last load of freight to downtown Kalispell. TR 874519 was loaded in Himes, Wyoming, and was unloaded at Northwest Drywall on December 14th. A few days later, the Mission Mountain came down to retrieve the empty. A week later, on December 27, 2019, the Mission Mountain sent a train downtown one more time to retrieve a cut of tank cars that had been pushed to the end of the line for storage. Before hooking up to the cut of cars, the crew stopped to take a few photos. Afterward, they picked up the stored cars and headed east towards Columbia Falls. The final run through downtown Kalispell came just a few days before the 120th anniversary of the Great Northern's arrival there. As the final train pulled out of town, a city official who helped spearhead the effort to build the new rail park mused that, quote, "When the railroad came to Kalispell in 1892, it was the beginning of a new era. Now, as the railroad leaves 128 years later, another era is set to begin." In early 2020, developers began to bring down the old grain elevator. Weeds are growing up between the rails that are expected to be ripped up later this year, and I plan on shooting the removal of the tracks to bookend my ongoing photo project, tentatively titled The End of the Line, although in recent weeks the scope of that project has changed dramatically. In March 2020, BNSF Railway informed Watco that it would not be renewing its lease of the 13-mile Kalispell branch. While the Mission Mountain will continue to operate a branch further west near Eureka, BNSF's decision to retake the Kalispell line has dramatically impacted the shoreline, which has had to let go of half of its employees as a result of the change. Thankfully, most of those railroaders were able to find work at other Watco operations. On April 1st, BNSF Railway resumed operations on the Kalispell branch, although signs of its return could be seen in the days before the official takeover date. A subtle reminder of just how fortunate I was to have the type of access I've had over the last few years. The events of the last few weeks are a reminder that the story of transcontinental railroading in the United States is still being written 151 years after the Golden Spike was pounded into a wooden tie at Promontory, Utah. That decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away can still impact communities all across the country. The images that I've made along the Kalispell branch in the last few years are among my favorites, because they're also a reminder that the story of transcontinental railroading, and just railroading in general, really is a story about people, even in this modern age. It's a story about immigrant laborers who pushed a railroad into an unforgiving wilderness. It's a story about people who followed the railroad west in search of a better life, as we'll see up next in Elron's program. And it's a story about the men and women who still work on and rely on these rails put down more than a century ago. Because the story of transcontinental railroading did not end at Promontory in 1869. It's a story that continues to this day in places like Whitefish and Kalispell and communities all across the American West. And it's a story I have immensely enjoyed telling in the last decade, and I appreciate having the opportunity to share my version of that story with you this afternoon. And I also want to take a quick moment and thank Scott and Ken and the entire CRPA staff for their hard work during these trying times. I have mostly just been an observer of this effort, but it's been incredible. When Conversations was canceled, some could have just thrown up their hands, but the CRPA crew stepped up and put together a fantastic lineup of programs, and in my mind, that is what exemplifies what's great about this organization. And I also want to thank all of you who are attending virtual Conversations, particularly those who are attending their first CRPA event. The shows that were posted throughout the week have been top-notch, and that shouldn't be a surprise considering all the great work that the center does. And I hope that those of you who have not attended an in-person conference before consider it in the future. As you can see, the center always gathers a top-notch series of presenters, and more importantly, I think it's just a great way for people in our hobby to connect. So thank you so much to Scott and the entire CRPA staff for pulling off this incredible feat in such a short amount of time.
Well, Justin, thank you, and thank you for an outstanding presentation today. I love how you tell me the transcontinental story to the local railroad scene right there in your home area. And I'm curious, because you're a journalist there, and because you follow the railroads very closely there, and because Whitefish is a tremendous railroad town, I'm just curious if you could say a little bit about the overall relationship of the railroad to the kind of the general public in Whitefish.
Whitefish is it's interesting because even though for so many years the community of Whitefish was a railroad town, it was a logging town. When they first when Whitefish was first established, it was called Stumptown because there were so many cut logs and stumps. In recent decades, Whitefish has become more of a tourism-based economy. Same with the entire Flathead Valley. But the railroad is still very much a part of the community. It's still very much in front of the community. It's, while Kalispell is ripping up the tracks and replacing the tracks through town with a trail, now that the industrial park has been built just east of town, in Whitefish, the railroad yard is still very much in the middle of town. Where I live about a block from the tracks. In fact, I think BNSF might have interrupted me at one point during the program, so apologies on their behalf. The Whitefish is, the railroad is still a big part of Whitefish. If you stand in downtown Whitefish and look north, you see three things. You see Big Mountain, you see the historic NW5 that's on display, painted in Great Northern paint, and you see the historic Great Northern Depot. And so, the railroad is still very much a part of the community here.
And I'm really going to put you on the spot with this one, and feel free to answer or not at your leisure. But I'd be delighted to know some of the things you're looking forward to working on at your new employer between Railroad Craftsman and Railfan and Railroad.
Are Otto and Steve listening right now?
No.
Telling us to take permission to talk freely, Justin.
Oh God, man! Well, had I known my boss was going to be in, I'm really incredibly fortunate to have gotten this opportunity. I never thought I would have the opportunity to work for Railfan and Railroad and RMC, and I'm really looking forward to getting my hands dirty and helping make what's already a really fantastic, or what are already really fantastic publications, and making them even better. I just think that there's still a place for good publications in life in general, and within our hobby, and I really want to help Otto and Steve make Railfan and Railroad the best that it can be. And so yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to highlighting other people's work, and also putting in a few of my own stories every once in a while. Actually, been working with my dad, Tim Franz, on a story about the photographing 25 years of photography along the Canadian Pacific and Western Maine, which used to be the Canadian American Railroad, then Montreal, Maine and Atlantic, and then the Central Maine and Quebec. And my dad and I worked together on a story about our photography from the mid-90s until this year, now that piece of railroad is being again taken back by the Canadian Pacific. And so that's one of my own stories that I'm working on for the magazine right now, but I'm mostly really looking forward to helping other people get their work in the magazine, because it's a community, and I want to get as many voices in print as possible.
Well, we're really lucky to continue to have some great print journalism outlets in the railroad community with really several outstanding publications, Railfan and RMC being right there among them. And you mentioned some of the projects you're working on right now, including the one with your dad, which just sounds fantastic. I love stories that kind of look at those relationships, including some of the ones that we've seen today and earlier on our pre-recorded shows on YouTube, like Orrin Helbach and George Hyotis and their travels together, and Todd Halamka and Travis DeWitz and their travels in China together. But I'm curious too, because of your role in journalism and your role as a storyteller, and the changing nature of the railroad industry, what are the stories in railroading that you think are going to be the most important to tell in the next few years?
I sort of briefly touched upon at the very end of the program, is that we're entering this age of this, the number of railroaders out there is continuing to decline. I think last year, the first time in U.S. history, or the first time since the government began gathering employment data about railroaders, the number of railroaders in the United States dropped below 200,000. And, there's a number of reasons why that's happening. But I think it's important to realize that railroading doesn't happen without people, even in this modern age that we're entering in. And I think sort of telling stories that reflect that, the human aspect of railroading is really important. And I know that's really tough in 2020. I should tell, actually, one of the reasons I did the project on the Kalispell branch, on that little section that was going to get abandoned, or has now been abandoned, was a couple of years ago when Blair Koister did his incredible program on photographing the last years of the Milwaukee Road in Washington. I saw that program he did for Winter Rail, and I remember just sort of being I was blown away by it, but I was also sort of deflated, because I was like, that type of access is tough to come by in 2020. Railroads are not, letting people just wander around wherever they want. I can't just walk into the Whitefish rail yard. And so when Blair did that incredible program, I wanted to try and find a way to do something similar. And of course, that's hard in 2020. But I knew with my access, or with my job at a newspaper, that I had an excuse or an in to try and get in with the local short line, the grain elevator, and the drywall place. And so, I took that like jealousy and frustration and moved it into that project and really attacked it. I know that I'm incredibly fortunate to have had that opportunity and that chance to tell that story, because I had that press pass, so to speak. But I still think there are opportunities and there are ways to tell human stories about railroading. And so those are the stories that are, to me, the most interesting and the most attractive, because those are as we saw in the J. Parker Lamb program a little earlier today, the photos of people are always the funnest to look at, and they're always the most interesting. And they're rare in 2020, and I think that makes it a little more special.
Well, this is a really shameless plug, but I wonder if you might mention any stories you might be working for any other publications in the not-too-distant future.
Wow, that was a blatant shameless plug from you. Yeah.
It's part of my job. I'm sorry.
I am actually tomorrow. I'm going to be sitting down and writing a bit of a story for the next issue of Railroad Heritage about railroad maps. It is Scott and I started talking about the story a few months back when I had gotten an email from a gentleman who does these really neat sort of fanciful transit maps of proposed transit lines that were never built, or old transit lines that are long since gone, and he puts them in like a modern format. And
I should just add, one of those actually now hangs in Inga Velton's office at the center.
Awesome.
One that he had done actuly for Madison.
Oh, very cool.
We hope to be able to get back to the office and see it again someday.
And so, yeah, this guy had emailed me, and I think it's Jake Berman, and emailed me, and the maps are just beautiful. And so I sort of went to Scott and said, I think this could be a cool story for Railroad Heritage, and we tossed some ideas around, and we sort of widened the scope of the story. And so it's, I've done a ton of interviews with Jake, the guy who sent the original map, and other map makers. Also did a Q&A with the executive director of the New York Transit Museum, because they had an exhibit about a year ago now called Navigating New York, which is a look at the New York City subway map and its different versions, and so they did a big exhibit on that. It was a really fantastic exhibit. I saw it last year when we were in New York, and so I did a Q&A with them, and just talked to a bunch of really interesting people. And so the story will look at the history of maps, railroad maps, and how they are inspired all sorts of arts over the years.
So the art of the railroad map coming in the next issue of Railroad Heritage.
Yes. Don't miss it. I need to get up early tomorrow and finish it.
Get back to work.
All right. See you, boss.
I'm stealing out of Audrak's line.
I know. I have too many bosses on here.
Yeah, that's the life of a freelancer.
Yeah.
Although I guess you're not really a freelancer anymore, but there we
go. Mix them back.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Justin, thank you again for sharing your work with us and for providing a really kind of a personal look at the northern transcontinentals. And Haley just reminded me that Railroad Heritage is the center's quarterly journal. It goes out as a benefit to all of our members. And again, Justin's piece will be in our summer issue, which should be hitting mailboxes around June 1st, subject to timely arrival of his story.
All right, I'm going to get to work. Have a good rest of the day.
Well, Justin, thanks again.